what's the deal with the methylene blue? What are the supposed benefits?
There's a lot of supposed benefits, cognitive benefits. There are supposed benefits in terms of increasing cellular respiration, cellular communication. If you take it sublingually, not put it in water, because when you put it in water, it actually changes the compound's constitution. It can increase light absorption and help your conversion of light into energy, which is something that we all kind of need to do a little bit more of. It's something I'm learning a little bit more about. I don't have the technical know-how to explain it in a succinct, scientifically accurate way, but generally speaking, light is associated with increased energy, not just in plants, but in human beings as well.
And have you felt any of that? Any anecdotal evidence so far?
Anecdotal evidence, absolutely. The research that I find most interesting about methylene blue is its effects on treating autism, bipolar disorder, depression, and PTSD. The big thing that I found really, really fascinating was in PTSD studies, it helped people let go of associative memories and fears. And that was very fascinating to me, because it's like, well, how, like, biochemically or neurochemically, what is that? What changes are happening that are helping a person let go of associative fears? And so I took it because I wanted to have a little bit more energy, because I'm fascinated by nootropics and trying to optimize my cognitive function as much as I can to fuel other experiments that I'm doing in regards to meditation, emotional regulation, and the different effects that has on my physiology. So I'm taking it as a supplement, mostly to enhance the cognitive side of things for myself, and seeing if that can feed into the meditation, which feeds into my physiology, this big endless loop of these changes that I'm trying to do.
Nice. Well, I suppose I should probably give you a proper intro, even though it's fun just to jump into conversation sometimes. But this is Anthony Manuel, co-host of the Art of Move podcast. You've got a lot of different hats, so I don't even want to go through the whole list of them. But essentially, at this point, you become a marketing powerhouse for the functional fitness community, a resource for a lot of different people. And it's been cool to kind of watch you just kind of engage with the community and begin to form relationships with those various movement systems. We've seen you kind of like talking with Naudi, talking with Weck, obviously tons of different guests on the podcast. And I know you have like relationships with these people outside of that, which is kind of cool and something that I want to get into over time. But what kind of got you into the marketing space at the first outset?
Well, I was a personal trainer for several years, and I wanted to get out of the commercial gym that I was working at, and I wanted to start doing stuff online, because I had a personal training client who made whack tons of money doing online coaching. And I remember he walked in, he was a guy who was like a year older than me. And he's like, I need a personal trainer. And I'm like, I'm a personal trainer. He's like, all right, let's sign up for 6 months. And I'm like, that's like $3,600. He's like, here's cash. And I'm like, what the fuck does this guy do? So when I started learning about the fact that he was doing marketing and coaching and helping people do products online, my curiosity was sparked. And then over the next 10 years, I tried to study digital marketing, because I quit my job at The Good Life, failed miserably trying to run an online fitness business at the time, got really frustrated. And I was kind of doing this back and forth thing where I would have some success selling courses and different info products online. And then I'd get distracted, and I'd have to go work another job, and I would kind of go back and forth. And it was a struggle for over 10 years. Eventually I got a couple of lucky breaks, and I started working for some tech guys, and was able to really use all the information that I'd learned, and had a bit of an advertising budget, and I had a team, and I was able to work with other people, and I was able to produce these good results in the tech industry. And then through that, it was kind of word of mouth. And then it was funny, because the podcast sort of started, I was working for this company called No Filter Network, which is a live streaming company. They asked me to start a podcast as a use case. And my co-host, Dr. Will, and I had just been talking for hours about functional fitness anyway. Him and I had planned to start a podcast ages ago, not about fitness. We were going to talk about like philosophy and society and life in general, but we have been talking about biomechanics and functional fitness. So just as a use case for this tech company I was working for, we started the Art of Move. And then through all of the other connections that I made through the podcast, eventually I started working more with functional fitness clients, which actually made more sense for me than to work in the tech industry, because I have a background in fitness. I have a passion for it. I can understand the language. I know the marketing behind it. And I've been much more successful helping functional fitness coaches in general market and communicate their value, even more so than tech companies, you know? So that's long story short.
Yeah, makes sense. So, yeah, obviously you've done a fair amount of stuff with us. You've taken our certification course.
Mm-hmm.
You've obviously like had a relationship with Nate and whatnot. So we'll get into that over time. But I'm interested in kind of picking your brain off the outset as just like a resource a little bit for, again, other trainers and coaches, and even some of our own like coaches that just got certified with us, and just like, what should their focus be on, and kind of what have you tested that hasn't worked out. Even that could be in terms of like habits, like just productivity hacks or whatever. Like what's maybe common knowledge that is maybe overrated, as well as like what stood the test of time for you.
Could you give me more context? What's the outcome that you're looking for? And could you just define the question just a little bit more for me so I can give a more clear answer?
Yeah, so you've been able to successfully give a blueprint for your clients to like succeed essentially, right? And that success comes in a lot of different forms, right? Usually there's some kind of like monetary background, and usually there's the online portion of it, the kind of
Hmm.
digital marketplace investment, if you will.
Hmm.
And there's the execution side of things that you could get into, but there's also the like just pure productivity side of things, because I think that's something that you've clearly done well because you have a lot going on and you seem to be managing it pretty well.
So the biggest obstacle that I personally had over the last 10 years trying to run a business that is oriented around marketing and digital, making money online was actually just self-management. I was diagnosed with ADHD, which basically just means I look at Instagram too much instead of work, and I get distracted by bullshit. And I think the big thing that holds a lot of people back is having a lot of their energy and attention tied up in low value bullshit, um, like distracting, instant gratification, lower order desire stuff. That could be as simple as eating junk food, distracting yourself with your cell phone, going on Netflix marathons, and a lot of things that basically lower your baseline dopamine levels, make you feel demotivated, and aren't relevant to the person who you want to be or the outcomes that you want to achieve. And this is something that a lot of people struggle with, I think, because our society is really oriented around convenience and around instant gratification. And a lot of the work that I had to do on myself, actually, like one of the earliest information products that I did was a habit course and talked about the neuropsychology of habits. I was an addictive personality, if you want to call it, without getting like into too much graphic detail about my past. Like I struggled with addictions in my past. I struggled with lack of productivity and highly distracted, self-destructive behavior. And a lot of my success was contingent on dealing with these lower order priorities, sabotaging my efforts to be a productive, focused human being. And in a lot of cases, I found it was being brutally honest about my behaviors, my subconscious compulsions, doing hard audits of how I actually was spending my time, and then learning to play chess with my lower order priorities. It's like there's this metacognition that's like, I want to start a business. Okay, well, if you want to start a business, you have to do market research. You have to put together the courses. You have to do all the back end stuff. You have to learn how to write email sequences. You have to put together these systems. You have to run ads. You have to do all this stuff. You have to brand yourself. You have to be consistent. You have to do outreach. You have to do a lot. And a lot of that stuff is not fun to do. Your brain, if it is conditioned to get instant gratification and things that are just convenient, then you're going to be resistant to it. So learning how to, again, play chess with your mind that is driving your behaviors towards habits that are not contingent towards or not relevant to your goals. That's been like the biggest thing that I've had to teach people. Now, ideally, I don't want to do a lot of work with that, with the people who are at that level of their personal development, right? Like I would rather get someone who's highly motivated and is like, no, you know what? Like I work my ass off already. I just need the right systems in place so that my business can scale. I need to know how I can communicate my value to a broader audience, because the audience that's currently engaged with me is very niche. And the only reason that they understand the language that I'm using is because they're a bunch of nerds too, who use the same language I do. So I need to learn how to translate my value to a broad audience. And, and I'm willing to do the work because, I'm sick of being where I'm at. Like what I'm doing isn't working. I'm already working my ass off. I'm already working 12 hours a day servicing clients and doing all this shit. What are the systems that I need in place? So, first of all, get your behaviors in order and make sure that you're not wasting a bunch of time, energy, effort, and destroying your dopamine with low value bullshit that is distracting. After that, figure out systems that you can put into place that are high leverage, that can outsource the amount of time that you actually have to spend running your business, because there's a lot of stuff that end up being time drains that you can outsource to either technology, for example, automated email sequences, automated responses for your DMs. If you're doing a lot of business through Instagram, there's like all different kinds of systems that you can put in place that save you time and energy that you could otherwise spend on higher leverage, higher value creative endeavors, like putting together better courses, designing new offers, coming up with new ad campaigns, creating content that's going to educate and nurture your audience. So, put together the right systems. The other thing is understanding how to communicate your value is like fucking imperative, right? Because if you just say it's like, hey, I got this thing to offer and it's really, really great, and a person doesn't understand what's in it for them, how it relates to their problem, how it relates to their actual the problem that they're solving, the thing that they want to experience, then they're not going to care, right? So it's understanding that you might understand your value inside out, upside down, and backwards, and you might have the testimonials, and you might have all the reason in the world to understand that what you have is valuable. If you do not know how to communicate that to people who are in different buying temperatures, right? Like the person who's never heard of you, for example, has no reason to trust the fact that you're saying that what you have to offer is valuable. So learning how to communicate to different people in terms of like their different consciousness levels and where they're at and how, like where they're going to be seeing your message, that's also a pretty imperative skill. There's so much that I could say, but in general, it's like, hey, make sure that you're not succumbing to lower order desires first and eliminate as many distractions as possible. Then figure out how you can systematize most of what it is that you're doing so that you can save time and energy, and then learn to focus. Like focus is the number one thing. Like as someone with ADHD, I realized that focus is actually a skill that you can cultivate. It's a skill that you can lose if you don't use it. And you can decondition yourself out of being able to sustain long form focus, which is why I prefer reading books and listening to podcasts as opposed to like shorter videos or Instagram reels at this point in my life, because I want to be able to condition my mind to sustain focus. But focus is a skill, and you need to cultivate that skill and then direct your focus towards the things that are ultimately relevant to the outcome that you're trying to accomplish. With that in mind, you also need to clearly define the outcome that you're trying to accomplish, because if you're aiming at nothing, you're going to hit nothing. So, clearly define your outcome, focus all your attention on that, systematize your life as much as you can to free up energy and attention so you can dedicate more energy, focus, and attention towards that outcome, and then relentlessly go after all the lower order bullshit that's distracting you from achieving your that particular aim. So that's what I would say.
I want to touch on a couple of points that you just brought up. Being able to deliver focus or train focus while also at the same time learning the ability to create space for, as you said, higher order processes. So respective the creating space part, I mean, to create a habitual allowance for effort tolerance is like a prerequisite to being able to learn new behaviors. So giving yourself a quality of, I may make mistakes or I may not do this perfect, are registries of those lower order behaviors becoming more clear such that you can make higher order behaviors. So like the processing of fear, the processing of whatever circumstantial predictions you have, either your ability to resolve that those predictions don't serve you in the moment, or being able to task yourself in a semi-threatened environment such that you no longer have as much threat around those tasks. So how I hear you describing this is for you creating focus, because it wasn't so much like individual linear behaviors so much as it was compounding the compound effect so much. So what I'd like to at least bring to note or touch on the topic of, did you find or have you found in our relationship, especially in the cert, that you've given yourself more access to or more accessibility to the effort tolerance without having to make it so much of a higher order behavior, allowing for that space to be created, so to speak?
Yeah. So one of the things that I noticed through doing a lot of the MovMed work is an increased capacity for patience in general, and not needing everything to feel good. It's funny because it's like because my overall inner state just feels good, I didn't need other tasks outside of myself or other points of effort to feel good in order to make me feel good, because I was already feeling good. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, you accept how you are present. There's not a need for anxious pretensions or like past bearing maintain tensions. You can just adapt.
So one of the things that you kind of mentioned was this idea of like like a fear around a task, or like a threat around a task. And that's, that is actually a big part of the work that I end up having to do with some clients when they hit these mental barriers of, they reach a certain level of success and they have a hard time imagining themselves being the type of person that could make more money or ask for more, or expand their business more, because maybe there's an association with increased responsibility, there's increased visibility, there is it's dissonant with a belief that they have about themselves, about how much success they deserve or how much success they can handle. And that effort tolerance, in terms of, it's not necessarily that they're not capable of doing the work, but there's a dissonance in terms of how they see themselves and what they believe about themselves, or about the, like you said, the threat that success, that next level of success would come to. Like one example was, I kept myself below a certain income bracket for a while because I hated the idea of paying more taxes. And so it was like, I didn't do more work because I didn't want to give the government more money. And I didn't want to have to, take a bigger chunk out of my own pocket, which is completely irrational. Like, doesn't, it's completely and totally irrational. And so, the thing about MovMed that I've noticed is this quality of feeling safe and feeling capable. There's a feeling of capability. And when you feel capable, you feel like you're able to handle stress, you're able to handle problems that come your way. This idea of having like a negative side effect of success becomes increasingly less relevant, and you're able to lean into the character traits or the qualities that you need to embody in order to move to that next level a little bit easier. One of the ways that I've heard you describe some of the work that I really liked is that it gives you more room to fill into your own personality. And that is something that I've noticed tremendously in terms of just like the analogy that comes to mind sometimes is, especially when doing the deep pressure work. So, putting in a 120-pound sandbag on my chest and creating this external pressure so that I can, create an internal pressure to match it. There's like, that's almost how I look at the embracing of taking on more responsibility or taking on some of the challenges that are associated with increasing levels of success. You're trying to match, you're trying to fill yourself out to create an equalizing pressure against the external pressure of the things that you're experiencing or the challenges you're experiencing in your life. Does that make sense?
Yes, entirely. I mean, you can see the correlative in language when people use the words drowning to affect the experience of being overwhelmed or over encumbered. It's usually not being at the top of the hill where you're being weighed down as much as you are being pulled down. And that's the visual I think a lot of us have when we're, and it's largely to do with the panic of pressure. I mean, literally, atmospheric pressure depreciates, or our perception of our tolerance for atmosphere depreciates when we're in something that is more atmospheric than what we're used to. So say we have burdens on our mind and we start to absolve ourselves of normal reflexive action because we start to just scrunch our face, and thereby the correlative points in our midline that were developed at the same time in embryological stage are gonna scrunch up in the same fashion, and thereby we have this whole midline consistency where someone may be demonstrating rotation or demonstrating tension, but at the end of the day, it could be fear. It could be fear-minded. It could be like there was trauma that diminished this person's accessibility to certain ranges of motion because they always kept their head down. Or it could be, in my case, having hit my head, my eyes weren't always as easy to focus as I'd like, but having some of the therapy I did, like visual therapy I did as a young kid, I got some tooling to make some of my crazy work. And I mean, I think at the end of the day, what I'm trying to touch on, because there is a real good opportunity for someone that is coherent with so many different fitness realms and being able to speak to so many people who provide different aspects of essentially the same message. But at the end of the day, when you've taken a piece or you've tried the different messages, you're like, oh, these do have different flavors. They're not quite the same thing, even though they say the same words. So I want to touch on, even though we don't say we're biomechanics, even though we don't say we're performance, even though we don't say we're muscle building, have you seen that your intrinsic wherewithal for biomechanical function, or you've gotten stronger, or whatever it may be, what things performance wise have you noticed that are related to other value systems?
I mean, a ton, like a lot. And like in a way that really surprised me, like really, really surprised me. And it didn't make sense to me. For example, like I have this 1.5 Captain of Crush that I can just, when I got it, I couldn't get anywhere close to closing it. It's an 165-pound gripper. I didn't do any grip work at all during the entire cert, but at the end, I just picked it up and I could 2-rep it.
Yeah.
Like I was like a half inch away from being able to close it at the start of the cert, and without any direct grip work, was able to close it. So that's a tangible increase in strength. My sprint mechanics and sprint speed got better without sprinting for 2 months. Riddle me that. You know, in terms of being able to have strong, I was still doing running. I was doing like 5K runs, maybe twice a week, but I was not sprinting at all. And like I said, my sprint mechanics and sprint speed were both significantly improved. It felt like my feet got spring loaded and super, super secure. Whereas before, it's like, I always felt like I had fairly strong feet, but I didn't know they could feel this strong, especially when I'm pounding pavement. I'm on, wearing these field ground barefoot 0-drop shoes on, running full tilt, sprinting full tilt on pavement and feeling like it's, wearing Hokas on fucking turf or something, right? Like just feeling so, or like vapor flies, right? Just feeling like I'm like exploding. I felt spring loaded and really, really secure. The other funny, interesting thing, like after traveling recently, I flew to Turkey for a hair transplant. These guys flew me out to film a promotional video, and they gave me a free hair transplant, and it was this whole experience. But flying back, I had a 3-hour flight to Frankfurt. Had to sleep on like a bench in Frankfurt. Like my flight was super, super early in the morning. I was in all these like contorted positions, sleeping and resting, sleeping on the plane. 9-hour flight back to Canada, and just like in every weird suboptimal position you could find yourself in. But getting off the plane, getting home, I didn't have to stretch. I didn't have any aches or pains. My body just had this natural structural soundness where even if I'm, right now I'm on my walking treadmill, but I started sitting at my desk a little bit more, because it's like, I wonder what would happen if I just sat. Am I gonna fall apart? Am I gonna start feeling back pain again? Am I gonna start having these little aches and pains? I don't have any pain in my body ever. And I went for a hike with some gym rat buddies, and they're, they get to the top and they're like stretching and they're like getting the whole hip flexor thing going on and like using rocks to smash their glutes. And I'm just like, guys, I'm good. Like I'm totally fine. I don't need to stretch. Like my body is structurally sound. Now, what I found interesting is I didn't do any other, other than maybe some gymnastics ring strength work, just because I'm a little vain and I like having upper body musculature. Other than that, I didn't really train at all during the entire process of the certification. and I maintained really good muscular tone. I got pretty fucking lean, and I felt strong and like regulated. And happy. I mean, that's the other thing. I found it very, very easy. Like, my meditation practice is oriented around the cultivation of positive emotions, first and foremost, because my nervous system in general has been conditioned to be high stress, on alert, feeling like I'm always going to lose everything that I've accumulated for myself. And in general is always waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I find it really hard to enjoy the things that I'm blessed to have in my life. And I don't like that. So I'm trying to, have this meditation practice to condition my nervous system to be comfortable with positive emotions and to not feel like they're a threat and that they'll make me complacent and blah, 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 blah. That's a very difficult thing for me to do in general because of my history of having things fuck up in my life. Now, it was a lot easier for me to sit and meditate and cultivate positive emotions the more I got into this work. And you could say, well, maybe it's just because your practice is improving, but it was like a direct correlation in terms of improvement. Like the more frequently that I was doing my MovMed practice, it was like a positive correlation between the amount of positive emotions that I could accumulate during my meditation practices. So those are a few of the, athletic and then less tangible benefits that I experienced during the certification process. The biggest thing was just like, how the hell am I so strong, stable, and pain-free? Doing no, tangible biomechanics work, doing no, flexing, like mechanical integration, whatever. It's like, you're not moving, doing fancy stuff or creating lines of tension or doing any of the stuff that I enjoy doing, but I'm not doing any of this stuff. How am I improving so much? And that was the perplexing part for me. What I did find was that all the biomech and mechanics work and patterning and all the stuff that I had done for like a year and a half prior, because again, I have explored a lot of different systems. I've done some Weck and some Goda and some functional patterns and some OKF, and I've done pretty much anyone who we've interviewed, I've delved into their system for a minimum of 3 months typically was the bare minimum that I would do so that I could speak from a more experiential perspective. What I found was all the benefits that I was thinking I was getting from them sort of integrated and actualized when I started doing MovMed. So it was like I was kind of getting the swing of things and I was kind of understanding. It's like, okay, I'm feeling integrated here. Okay, like my hip is like rotating this way. This is cool. Okay, all right. My movements, oh, I'm feeling like kind of bouncy. This is good. My glutes are activating this way. This is fine. But I had to think about it a lot. And I had to really, I was intellectualizing my movement quite a bit. With MovMed, it was like all of a sudden, all those benefits that I was trying to do with these other strength training or these other resistance training approaches just appeared in my movement reflexively. And that's the big difference, right? It's the reflexive component as opposed to the neurotic acting out of movement. That was the big like, ooh, there's something to this. This is really interesting.
So I want to make one point, and I'm going to actually pass it to Ben because I think he has a better take on this. But what I'm thinking, respective that calming effect, the ADD stuff, above anything that tailors into this programming, even if it's gait related and someone loves it, even if it's deep pressure therapy and someone loves it, what I needed to do was fix my signaling so that I didn't have so much irregular signaling. And so I didn't feel like it was a battle to I used to have an issue projecting my voice, and talking or thinking about the subject can make me have some resonant ear issues. I feel my ear ringing or whatever if I'm too focused on it. But in the same, if I embrace the fact that there's new stimulus that I can tolerate, that I built objective or intentional focus around, then there's space or memory for me to, at the very least, trust myself for a long enough period of time to feel like this is a neutral or a something I can optimize from instead of having to continuously self-repair. And one of those boundaries that I think many of us struggle with, you struggle with in your own work, detailing to other people how they can how they can further their.
I think you froze.
Yeah, it was just getting good too.
Got a little pause on my end.
All good.
That's always good, right?
Yeah, it's nice to have an abrupt stop in the podcast at least once.
Yeah, right. At least once. Make sure people are paying attention. Did you want to pivot off something he was saying there?
Yeah, I guess we can kind of. Oh, I thought I saw a screen move, but maybe not. Yeah. Um, yeah. So I'll kind of pivot more so onto what you were describing as the benefits and the process, because it'll make like no sense to somebody how you could have made those gains that you were
Mm,
describing without doing all this stuff. Like, what? Okay, then what were you doing?
mm,
And there's definitely effort there, right? It's not like you weren't putting in a lot of effort and intention into yourself. It was just in a very different way than you had previously.
mm.
Hey guys,
Hello.
Hey,
just trying to turn my computer off and on, and it was like as soon as it was like, okay, there's a meeting in progress. Yeah, no shit. Thank you for putting it back on.
That's
uh,
funny.
did you want to get back to what you were saying, Nate? Or me and Anthony were just talking about like what was he doing to get those gains? Like where was the effort if it wasn't into all this other stuff?
Yeah, so for me, a lot of it was the in the irregular state, we build up habits and patterns that kind of like when you go fight or flight, it's a distinct transition for a lot of us. And it's not to say that our mind and personality change, but the tonal response, that is to say, all the places that we do have underdeveloped or maybe sustaining sympathetic tone very often, when they transition from fight or flight or from you're just neutral, maybe you're not overstimulated, maybe you're not relaxed enough. But when you stimulate into fight or flight, there's a degree of upregulation regardless. So if you've already started from a base sympathetic, it's going to continuously upregulate. And for me, and I imagine this is a lot of what neurodegenerative diseases are, like when we get later in life for Alzheimer's and dementia and things like that, where there's so much consistent output with very little input processing. So
Mm,
the idea is everything's focused around the sympathetic tone that's like active and ready. And I'm coherent with these expectations. Even if other things might happen, I'm always expecting these things. So I can't really pay attention to good stuff happening because there's always this precipitation. I'm always like, there's going to be this no matter what. And if we don't cognify that and we don't put language to it, then our personality changes because our vibe, so to speak, just our like energetic threshold dampens. And so we have to increase our mental output, again, increasing outputs, not considering input dysregularity. So it like remolds the body in such a way that it starts to atrophy, it starts to inflame, it starts to desensitize or oversensitize or just send weird signals. And then by the end of the day, it's like ADHD or ADD or gender dysphoria, whatever you'd say is a neurodivergent behavior cycle. It could be something that someone's literally just, their nerves are dying or their nerves are not being fed well enough. And then as soon as we reoxygenate, not over-oxidize, that is not to say have oxygen free around the environment, but in the environment, saturating and nourishing it, well, then we have a pump. But otherwise, we have a constriction because there's too much adipose tissue, too much, I don't know what's in my body, and we can't feel or interocept. So there's this feeling of, I need a propriocept to bring back that awareness. But at the end of the day, we need to learn how to wash it off, clean it off. And the sponging effect is tolerance of effort without having to be super intentional about where that effort goes, aside from I need to feel better. I need to feel better. I need to feel better. And if you spend enough time with yourself saying, I'm going to make myself feel better,
mm.
you start believing you deserve it.
Well, I think that too, the inherent belief. I was listening to an interview with Anthony Bourdain actually, where he was struggling with addiction, and he said the only reason he kind of got out of it was that he believed in his inherent worth and believed that he shouldn't die. Now, ironically, he did end up killing himself, but like that idea of having a self-belief that you, even if you don't necessarily deserve, like you don't have the belief that you deserve to feel better, acknowledging that you want to feel better and leaning into that desire to want to feel better. And I think the inherent temptation that we have in general is to outsource the feel better to something in our external environment, whether that is distraction from social media, whether that is a food, whether that is, like something stimulating. That stimulation is enough distraction for that lack of feeling good. And that's where that, that disconnect from interoception can kind of grow down the line, right? You can become reliant on these external things. That's what addiction is, I think, whether that's a substance or a person or, something in your environment that you continually use to distract yourself from how you feel. That's that what you said, it's like, I'm going to, like, repeating that I'm going to make myself feel better, having the intrinsic, or I call it like almost like an internal reference point where you can actually make yourself feel better. That's a paradigm shift for a lot of people. And most people don't even realize how much they're reliant on things in their external environment to distract themselves from how they feel. And I think it is mostly distraction. Like, I think most people are trying to forget about how they feel as opposed to actually make themselves feel better.
I want to touch on that. That's a nuanced point, because even though I wanted to feel better, I set myself to it from childhood. Being able to declare or verbalize my perceptions was not at the same regularity as other people. So if I'm communicating something to another person who doesn't have the same cognizance or sensitivity or wherewithal to self-analyze or at least question or doubt themselves, then I'm going to see a mirror of someone who doesn't understand what I'm saying, and I'm going to see that what I'm saying doesn't make sense. If I own that, then I'm going to continuously self-re-educate based off of other people's lack of involvement in what I'm actually saying. So at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of things socially lacking in most people, and that usually stems from a lack of like self and identity and like self-enriching behaviors. Dude, for the both of you guys, music, the ability for you guys to produce and create ideas and fantasy and still maintain imagination past the threshold of childhood. That's like the biggest thing. Reading does that for me, writing does that for me, and there's some things otherwise that do it for me, but it's a hard threshold to want for if your brain isn't producing that dopamine. So a couple of things to note on. If your body cannot undervalue the inflammation in your gut, then your midbrain is going to start to likely inflame, which is going to send your shit off the wall. And so if your emotion center is off the wall, then there won't be a regulation center until you register what is causing that divergent or shared inflammation. And for most of us saying the mind-gut connection, what we're really saying is the sensations or emotions that live in our organ system are to tell us how we feel in a place we can't see or touch. And that's to give us as much visceral control over something that's subconscious. So right now, for most of us, we don't have that control. I would suggest that that's under neutral. That's not healthy, that's not functional, and that's not connected. So if we're going to say fascia, well, let's start with the nerves and let's associate, if you can't feel something, you can't use something. So the connective tissue won't mean shit if there's no blood supply, because the nerves run through it. And so by end of like any of these arguments, even though I can go one direction talking about midline, another direction talking about like the buoyancy, how you talk to balancing your feet, feeling like, oh, I have this feeling of a pump, so to speak. Everything is reflexive. This is how we're base neutral could be. As we start to upregulate intrinsic systems, as a lot of these visual practices like Z Health talk about, you visually upregulate your system and start to do some sensory things additional, and then some biomechanical exercises with those cues in mind or those exercises in mind. I've taken it a different route, trying to facilitate that same upregulation without demanding focus that people don't have. Because something I struggled with in the Z Health practice, which I'm sure a great many people do, is the ability to retain a want or a desire to create new tasks when there's all these fucking decisions and behaviors being like, dude, what are you doing with a pencil right now? Get a hold of yourself. And it's fantastic. It's so great. But I'm drained worse than I've ever been over anything. Like, I've run a triathlon, and I'm less drained after a triathlon than I am from 35 minutes of looking at a pencil. Tell me why. So basically, if you can't provide yourself focus, you don't have a regular dopamine cycle. The correlative between dopamine, effort, testosterone, and focus are so interwoven that if you're not feeling a natural reflexive focus, you can associate that there's something burning itself on both ends. You're doing too much, and there's not enough self-regulatory allowance to give you permission to not focus so hard when you don't have the energy for it, which is sympathetics. That's fight or flight. That's threat mode. So permission to let go, and you'll find a lot of this in the book. I'm sure you're giving yourself you have plenty of time to go through it as you have access. But the book that's coming along with the cert, and we're going to start to hand out otherwise, is good detail on a lot of these issues. I wanted to facilitate these conversations, but also give a narrative response to, I'm in this industry working, coaching this. I'm in teaching. I'm in behavioral therapy. I'm helping people who are on the spectrum. Every single one of those people is helping people create or rehabituate behaviors. So if we can understand what limbic processing looks like, not just input processing, but limbic processing, how do we rationalize the effort? Then we get to understand how we can self-therapize. And that's what I'd really like to deliver in some function. And you guys have Ben more than anyone else. No offense, Anthony, we just met recently, but Ben more than anyone else has been like crucial and what's the word for it? I'm sure someone could help me with the word later.
Instrumental.
Thank you. Instrumental for it. Appropriate, being that you guys both play music things.
That's right. We jammed the other week a little bit.
Awesome.
I could not hold a candle to Anthony's guitar playing whatsoever, so I just got on some like drums and just like played for him. Because Anthony, if you get the chance to see Anthony play guitar, do it. He gave me a little solo show that was nice.
That's a cool thing. I've only seen a couple of videos.
Yeah, he's got a catalog.
I have a Spotify. It's a secret Spotify. If you search my name, you can hear the funny things that I recorded.
If it's some years in the future, I want to see an emo comb over.
Well, I am growing it out. I'm gonna see. We'll see if I reach emo status at any point.
Well, if you
can see how good these Turkish doctors are.
You always put me to shame because this shit doesn't move. I look like I'm wearing a Lego hairpiece right now. I'll tell you what, that's only because it's in that awkward stage of I'm 5 inches down my face and it looks like an inch and a half, right? Like, what is that? The pump.
I want my fascial tensegrity to be as good as your hair.
Exactly. I learned something recently, respective the process of fascial development specific to the neural crests, and that's something that I've posted in the book. It's something that Dave is talking to me with, or he's educating me on a little bit. But the neural crest, they divide, like there's the cranial neural crest, there's a heart neural crest, there's the abdomen or like a midline one that becomes a division of the organs. And then there's the sacral neural crest. And when people say cranial sacral, because those things develop in sequence, the fascia that goes one place is co-innervated to another place so that the spine, when it's moving up here, knows where it has to balance. And if we take away that perception, then we lose out on a reflex that we all need. That's incumbently, like, dogs have it, animals have it. Why are we all like walking all weird? Well, because blood flow or limitation has made it so that I'd rather focus on how this manages things than how this manages things. Even though I'm observing the world up here, most of us are bringing our head closer to our sacrum to be able to manage the variability that goes in between all those fascial points, because each one needs to bloom in its own right. So like, think about it like a garden. You can't just think about we're going one centric flower. It's the ability to grow flowers here, the ability to grow flowers here, and so on and so forth, without the roots convoluting one another. But when they cluster, that's like a neuroplexus. That's like a collection of neurology that when people say there's a brain there, it's oftentimes a byproduct of just a bunch of nerves that make the most sense for that region. So why a lot of people move through the brachial plexus or a lot of people move through the solar plexus. There's a lot of plexi. That one I made up. There's a lot of them, and it just allows for us to be like variable without having to be, I'm thinking through my brain everywhere.
Anthony, would you say that like that's kind of the root of why you got your gains from doing this kind of work? Is it kind of took away some of those like congestive tendencies to like be overthinking through your movement? And obviously you can maybe speak as well to the like what were you physically challenged by with our work too, and how did you work through it?
So the one thing that I keep remembering in terms of like the biggest obstruction and the most effort that I had to put were movements or exercises orienting around my shoulder, because I had a shoulder surgery. There, was a huge injury there, and still remained of a lot of pain, restriction, and congestion. And I remember being so frustrated with the effort and so angry at how hard it was, and then powerless and like all these emotions that I don't normally feel in my day-to-day life. We were doing a session. It was actually a group session, and I had to turn my camera off and turn my mic off because I broke down crying. And it was like super, super emotional for me. And it was working through these fear-based inhibitions that were surrounding this injured part of my shoulder, this grief that I felt around not having the capacity to have my body move in the way that I was intending it to move. Like there was this like deep sadness where it's like, man, like all I want to do is press my fists behind my head.
Yeah.
It's not that fucking complicated. Why can't I do it? It was this like angsty grief that just overwhelmed my entire system. And it's interesting because when I really thought about it, it's like the way that I move in my life and the way that I chose to train and the movements that I specifically chose in terms of my gymnastics rings practice, my strength training, even my biomech stuff, it all had this pattern of avoidance because of fear of pain. And, this, and maybe consciously or subconsciously, but, working through some of these subconscious inhibitions, that was the most obvious one for me. But then when I was able to kind of observe some of the other elements of, what is this work actually doing? It was basically that. It was working through subconscious inhibition and also taking the time to, maybe you could say, create co-contractions or become aware of how, different parts of my body are simultaneously connected to one another through effort or mutual engagement. And that was, that was the process for me ultimately, was working through the subconscious inhibition that came up in terms of pain and in terms of, not like allowing myself to develop interoceptive awareness of how my structure is actually more integrated. I actually had anatomical realizations as well in terms of like how my obliques are connected to the, the rotation of my hip and the stability of my pelvis and my gooch. It was just very interesting because I've never felt my body interconnected in that way. And it's because of I could have logically and rationally understood it because I looked at the images from anatomy trains and I looked at the anatomy charts, and I understood on a conceptual level about how the body's interconnected. But until I actually created the nervous system inputs where those co-contractions happened, or that compression and that space that comes from the compression happens, and I'm just like deeply aware of my body as a whole, like the experiential reality made it real. It wasn't a logical understanding, it was a felt knowing.
Yeah, the emotions you felt, I think, were the most necessary process for you to slow down and give yourself space, because you can't ignore what you feel. You can think, you can ignore what your body feels, but you can't ignore what you're processing. So if you're fully in that overwhelm, which is a good thing relative being able to feel or process your overwhelm, there was a hesitancy at first. And I think that as we talked a little bit in that transitional point, I was like, dude, take your time, do your thing. This is not something that this is part of it. So this is good. And when you came back, we were still doing our stuff. I mean, I can attest to, not specifically in a MovMed practice, but in my own, like there was some cranial work I got done. And just as Chris, my mentor, had told me in his own experience, I walked outside, sun hit my face, and I cried from the amount of weight that it felt like I had shed.
Mm.
And it's not like this metaphysical, like connection to memories or something like that, as much as it is like the literal body is holding on to and preserving onto behavioral action that will allow for it to presuppose what's going to happen. And if it doesn't have language in the moments of stress, which is to say, if you didn't take that time and you just ignored it, or you're like, let's get back into focus, you would have ignored your dopamine cycle. That is, you would have ignored your motivation to stay interested in the thing. And you would have created this aversion to thinking about it as an emotional aspect. And when people do that, I'm like, I can't be your coach. There has to be some things that need to happen prior to, I'll put them off on Ben, or there's something off, there's something that we have to do that communicates some degree of, dude, if we're going to both be present to this, I need you to be present to this, because I can't do it for you. And that's to say, if you need to take a step away, communicate it. Awesome. We're doing great. This is where we're at. And then when we get back from that, we talk about, okay, what came up for you? Dude, I don't know. I'm feeling these fears, whatever. Okay, so you're recognizing that there was some panic or whatever in this area. And you're like, what do you mean emotions in this area? Dog, I don't know. It's your nerves are holding on to something. I mean, you could say it spiritually, you could say it metaphysically, you could say it whatever, but at the end of the day, it's happening. So long as we can associate the same thing that makes you feel those things is the same reason why someone who loses a limb retains that phantom value sometimes. Your nerves tell you a story, and if your feeling sensation will not input a different story, your brain will just analog with the expectation.
That's a very, very interesting point, because again, I think there was always this expectation that even though I'd gotten the surgery, I had to protect my shoulder, right? And I've done all manner of work to rehab it, to strengthen it, to stretch it, to stabilize, to like every type of fucking thing that you can articulate your shoulder doing, I've done, and it still hurt. And this has been the only thing that I've done where like I can handstand without pain right now, like for a minute straight, with my chest up against the wall, arms directly overhead, full thoracic extension. Like I can handstand without pain. That's mind-boggling to me, because again, I'm not doing any foam rolling or fucking fancy stuff. I'm not doing the 20-minute hanging challenge to, whatever. I'm just teaching my nervous system that it's like I can be safe here. Now, obviously, there's physiological stuff going on as well. I'm actually strengthening it, but like it's teaching your body to feel safe is maybe the biggest benefit that I've articulated to people who have asked me about what's your experience been like. It's like, I feel safe to be in my body and I feel safe to be myself. And that's kind of cool.
The irony is that the first few moments of conversation with some of these people who are a little bit more bombastic, so to speak, it's more confrontational. So they're like, I don't feel safe with this guy. There's no way. What are you talking about? Safety, stress to strong. And so in the same, I've realized that there's a degree of, I wouldn't say decorum. I would say the customer's always right, that I am not personally endowed with, where I go to Ben and I'm like, hey, Ben, how would you handle this aside from internet throttling someone? What would you do that would be appropriate in this measure? Hey, Anthony, I want to say this is like a marketing strategy to say this piece of shit, ... You're like, okay, note here. Let me just see if you take this one as an alternative, because some people might take that a little strong. And that's how I'm learning, guys. That's how I'm learning.
Well, it's funny because a lot of the training that you do is stress tolerance, and effort tolerance, right? And a lot of vocal feedback and critical feedback is stress and effort for a person to wrap their head around. And so when you're trying to confront these people and you're trying to have these, fruitful, like you could be very blunt with me and you could tell me I'm acting like a piece of shit and I'll listen to you. Well,
Yeah.
you specifically, because we have rapport and I
Yeah.
actually like and respect you. Right.
Yeah,
But, and so like, but you could be as blunt as possible and I wouldn't like have a nervous meltdown about it, because I just look at it as feedback. And rather than get emotional about it, I would just weigh it out and be like, all right, Nate's saying I'm a piece of shit because I'm doing this. Is he right? And then, whether or not you're right, I'll have a discussion with you about it. But for a lot of people, it's a threat. It's that feeling of a lack of safety. People don't like to, the point that you have about people not having a strong enough sense of self and, like a fortified personality necessarily is a fascinating concept to me, because I do think people outsource their personalities to opinions that they want to parrot or they feel like they resonate with, and they don't have a lot that they stand for personally. And when you call someone into question, it's like their already fragile, unfortified personality is easily crumbled, and they don't have the effort capacity, and they don't have the stress tolerance to be able to accept direct feedback in that capacity. So it's funny because feeling safe in my own body is a cool byproduct, but it's in my communication. Empathy and making people feel safe through my communication has been one of my main focuses, not just as a marketer, but as a person in general. When you were talking a little while ago about this idea of having people mirror back the fact that they don't understand you, that's something that I've gone through my entire life. I always feel like there's a depth of feeling and a depth of perception that I have that I can't fucking convey to people, and it drives me nuts. And it's why I learned music. It's why I started painting. It's why I learned how to write poetry. It's why I learned, the marketing communication tactics that I have, because it drove me fucking nuts that people don't fucking get it. And it's like, am I insane? What's that?
Everything there was limbic, by the way. That wasn't like although you had the intention to put words to it, it's all feeling. Socialized through feeling. That's, if anyone can pick up on this, like, dude, if you saw me 15 years ago, you'd be like, that's not a safe person to be around. I was more agitated, so to speak. Like I would get in fights all the time. As a little kid, I'm like all the time. I'd be in principal's office all the time. I'd be arguing with teachers. And it was just like, if you're not going to distribute or make me feel safe, I'm not going to work hard to do the same. I used to be what I would consider someone who could be on the threshold of that Alzheimer's dementia stuff before. Like I was worried about that, dude. My memory was and I was 22. And I wasn't substance abusing. I wasn't doing anything like that. I was 22 and I had just run a triathlon. I just got, maybe I didn't get mine just yet, but like there were things in my life that were like, I'm really excited to figure out how I can be an adult despite, okay, I didn't go to college. I didn't figure out these things for my job. I don't have these like tenable byproducts that I could work with. So I have to figure out how to make how I feel about myself be a reality. And my whole life has literally just been, okay, I don't feel good about myself. I can't make a reality of this yet. I had to, in the same way you were saying you were holding off on your tax bracket. I was holding off on my tax bracket so that I think in the way that how you start anything is how it ends. So you can see in the micro relationship, or you can see in the macro intention to start something that is like a journey towards something. And if I started MovMed and I was like, okay, I'm going to sell this, I'm going to sell whatever I can put out in my framework now, I would have sold people very unclear or whatever. That's why I focused on like one-on-ones. I did privates for the last 3 years until Ben helped me put together this like tangible that I can deliver people. And in having something that's tangible and having something that can be presented and communicated despite people's level, there's this degree of me not having to match other people's limbic processing level. Because when I'm like this and I'm like, dude, I don't give a fuck. I understand you're upset. Communicate why instead of just making that my problem. Like the repeated, like, I know what it feels like. You're making my ears ring. It's screaming in my head again. Let's figure out why we're both losing our minds right now. And it's all sensory dysregulation. And the more that we can recognize that, the more we realize there's a bunch of idiots around us just because they're not being themselves. They're being mirrors of people hiding from their own fears. So reflection, reflex, look at the two words and see if there's any correlative between watching something doing. Your eyes,
Cool.
the mirror. Ah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's some good stuff there, man. Something that you mentioned, Anthony, but first, do you need to be out of here kind of quick, or do you?
No, I'm good. I got about 20 minutes.
Okay, tight. You were talking about just like making the feeling of empathy and safety a focus of just like how you're communicating. And I think we've talked a little bit about it before, that you have a tendency to be very giving of yourself, maybe in that process, to make sure everyone in the room feels like safe or understood or like respected. And again, that's gotten you a very long ways and helps with your podcast, because you can, whoever is in the room, whatever they're throwing out, how to kind of help guide them along. And even in the case, well, at least you tried with like Naudi and Weck, where you tried to bring like those two minds together and kind of be that, but at the same time,
I didn't try to do that, by the way. I was thrown into that situation. I was utterly unprepared to try and negotiate a conversation between them. What's that?
Throw me into that puddle if you'd like. I'd love to muddy those waters.
They both blocked you, Nate, so they won't see it.
Probably likely.
I had assumed that you set that up, Anthony, but I don't know. I don't know if you want to get into the like that kind of thing. I think there's probably an interesting backstory.
We could touch on that later, but keep going. I'm curious about where you're going with this idea.
I see a lot of that in myself, and that I will be very giving of myself to make the other person in a relationship, or whatever, my client, the server at a restaurant, like, comfortable. And I think that that's a skill. I think there's like traits that are positive to have with that, and I'd be interested to kind of hear, as someone who identifies with that, like what you think some of those might be. But also, when can it be too much? When are you like almost not taking enough space for yourself?
Yeah, it can very easily get to be too much. And I think that comes with a certain level of discernment and self-awareness. And I'm still working on it because I kind of suck at it. I'm way too giving for people who are all too happy to take. And that is an ongoing process of self-discovery for me in terms of relationships. I don't have a good answer to that yet, but in terms of the positive qualities and some of the practices, there's two that come to mind right off the top of my head. Is when you're doing something that is confrontational, or you're expressing a negative emotion, say you're angry at someone, or you feel like a need is not being met. And I learned this actually through life coaching, is asking permission. And I know, Nate, you're not like a huge fan of this approach necessarily, but say that you have to have a conversation
a little bit less aggressively there. I have permission where it's appropriate. Thank you.
Yes. in terms of like direct communication about confrontational topics, I know that you have a more direct approach. That's how I'll rephrase it.
Talking. Yeah. Talking. Permission
yes.
is always my first.
Yes.
Thank you. Talking. I am. I'm
not
free with my hands, everybody. I'm not free with my hands.
Communicative context here. Like if you have to say that you're angry at someone, I will actually just say, hey, do you have a minute for me to talk to you about something? There's something that's been on my mind. It would mean a lot if I could talk to you about it. Right. And if a person says yes, or sometimes even if you need to give critical feedback to someone where they don't have a high tolerance for criticism, say, hey, do you mind if I give you some feedback on something I noticed? Oftentimes, them giving you permission to get to receive that feedback creates an open space of communication for a person to feel like they're not being attacked because they gave you permission. It's consensual now, right? Yeah. So that context setting I find really, really useful. The other thing is, like, as someone who feels aggravated constantly because people, like, the biggest thing that I get emotionally worked up over is when I feel misinterpreted or when I feel misunderstood. And so I want people to avoid having that feeling when they're communicating with me. Oftentimes I'll say, hey, can I just repeat back what I heard? And I do this all the time. If you've listened to our podcast with many of our guests, I'm like, hey, I'm just going to reflect back what I've heard so far, summarize it, make sure that we're all on the same track and that I'm actually understanding it, right? And so doing that and repeating back what, and sometimes in different wording, sometimes in the exact same wording, but I usually try to summarize and explain what I understand so that either a person's like, yes, that's amazing, I feel so understood, or like, oh, almost, you're missing this one point though, right? And so that gives an opportunity to not have any communication lost in translation, make the other person feel validated and understood and seen, which increases their confidence and their willingness to express themselves, in my experience. And I've done that not just in podcasts, but I've done that in, when I'm fighting in relationships. If I have a fight with a partner, I try to make sure that they feel heard and understood first. And then when they feel heard and understood, then they're more willing to hear and understand me, because they're coming from a place of like, hey, this person is in a collaborative effort, not in a maybe like an attacking intent, right? Like they're not trying to dominate me with their perspective and their needs. They're trying to find a mutual conclusion, right? And so I found that is, generally speaking, like two big high return on investment practices for communication that make people feel both understood and safe.
Question for you, related, but for a second, a distraction. Did you put me onto the War of Art?
Yes, I think possibly.
Cool. So there's a thing that I've learned as I like to read my books, but whenever they're a repetition of things that I could think faster than they could be phrased in like a clever way, I'm like, put it on my ears. So I read 10 fictional books this month, or like these last 2 months, but I've listened to 2 books. And so the War of Art is one of them. I really enjoyed it, but it was something that I had to like give time for. The validation acknowledgement point. So I don't know if you talked about acknowledgement, but I have a tendency to acknowledge people more in the state of where they're at, less so validate the process which got them there. So I don't take the time to verbalize or validate the experience of other people, but I acknowledge that that was hard, and that was like, if that makes sense. So, or not necessarily it's hard, but it got them to where they were. I respect that they have this whatever, but by not validating, I wasn't bringing to light that I was also paying attention to that, but I meant it in that one, like I was trying to give them both sides of the coin by showing them one thing. So in order to do better with that kind of relationship, recognizing that I didn't get validation when I would like go literally and be like, this is something I've done good. Would you like to give me a credit for it? Say it's my dad or something. There would be moments where it would be like this weird kind of translation of like how he interprets acknowledging it, but there wouldn't be a validation of it. So in his mind, he could have, but in my perspective, that wasn't happening. So it wasn't something that I inherently offered in turn. So by way of that, I'm learning that validation goes a long way toward the way of acknowledging. So I don't have to enable, I don't have to accept where someone's at as much as I have to give them clarity that I see what you're saying, I understand, and I accept your perspective. This is my perspective if you're willing to hear it. So the first part I didn't do. Second part, I was very quick to do. So people are like, you're skipping steps, dude. And now we're here. So I appreciate if that had come from you. Thank you.
There's a book called Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenthal, and you're welcome, by the way. I'm glad that you read that. It's like still one of my favorite books of all time.
Yeah.
I think people who are artists or who are working on any entrepreneurial endeavor, who have any sort of aspiration for self-expression and having some sort of meaningful self-initiated contribution to the world, should read The War of Art. It's fucking phenomenal. And his other books are really good too. They're extensions of his philosophy around that. And in general, they're all very, very enjoyable. But there's another book that has been really instrumental in terms of how I sort of approach hard conversations, called Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenthal. And he has some really hilarious YouTube videos where he has 2 little puppets where he's, like literally talking to a room full of adults, teaching adults how to communicate non-violently with these puppets, because adults are so thick-headed and so resistant to actually communicating in productive ways that he has to literally teach them with puppets. But in general, it follows a pretty basic formula. It's like, acknowledge the other person, and make a clear request for your needs to be met. That's there's more to that. There's actually a whole process that it's like, I think it's like a 4-step process that you go through. But the essence, when I boiled it down even more, was it's like, make the other person feel understood and validated and heard, and then make a clear request for your needs to be met. And, part of that is expressing how you feel in a way that is non-antagonizing. It's you taking responsibility for your own emotions, as opposed to like, you made me feel this way. You and your behaviors have made me feel this emotion. It's like, hey, I'm feeling really hurt because your opinion means a lot to me. And, that really hurt me. So in the future, if you're willing to do this, could you communicate more in this way or with this in mind? And so that way it's like, it's self-responsibility. It's not antagonizing. It's not blaming. It's not creating a fight necessarily. It's a lot of self-responsibility for your own emotions, while also having a clear communication for your needs to be requested to the other person. I think it's a very instrumental book in terms of my own communicative evolution. And I don't do it perfectly to a T, but I keep it in the back of my mind a lot. And especially how much self-responsibility for my own like feelings in this situation can I take? How much can I avoid blaming the other person for how I feel right now, while still communicating that I have needs within this relationship and boundaries that need to be respected. And so that balance, that's hard for a lot of people, but nonviolent communication is a pretty cool formula for how to strike that balance pretty well, I think.
I downloaded it to my Audible. Touching on that, I think the reason why it's important for each person to manage around their feelings in priority is we all have different needs. And my own wherewithal for my own behavior is that if I can bear the consequence of people not understanding me, but my intention being something that I'm fostering being more clear, then I'm okay with there being some negative feedback, it being a work in progress. And so for the last 3 years, there's been a lot of that work in progress. For the last 27, almost 28 years, it's been a work in progress. But the wherewithal that I had deficit, and that I wasn't getting good feedback from an early age, relative things that I wanted from myself or from my environment. And there were things that I knew that I had a competency for, I was better than other people at. But when it came down to me experiencing stress, I didn't care about the things I was good at anymore, because it was something that was distracting, or there was something that was more present or important, and I couldn't see a future without that threat being present. And if that threat were present, I wouldn't have the future that I'd want. So there was this correlative with always fighting or inner battling. And I mean, touching on a couple of things, I think this might be an appropriate call out and not an aggressive one, because I see myself in these two people in like high functioning, like borderline, does this guy have a condition? Weck and Naudi. So they're both really smart people. I've met Weck in person. I've spent a fair few hours in person, like I was working on him and experiencing his tangible tensions and tone. I've never met Naudi. I actually have no exposure to Naudi aside from him blocking me and getting sent maybe 450 posts in my last 3 years about a system I've never participated in. So by end of day, I mean, I only know what I've seen and what I can manage. I mean, like I've done body mechanical stuff like jujitsu, and I know what it's like to use 2 hands on one object and rotate my body and throw body weight. And the things that I saw in a lot of that was stuff that I fundamentally couldn't coincidentally put into my reflex. So if I was going to have to add tasks on my already overburdened, concussed head or my impacted spine, then it was just going to be something that was going to take away my athleticism, making me more depressed, anxious, whatever you wanted to call it. And I was severely affected. So if I were diagnosable, I'm sure there could have been 15 diagnoses. I was called schizophrenic recently by someone who couldn't handle their emotions in a conversation with me, but they've been invited on the podcast too. I would love to discuss with Weck. I would love to discuss with Naudi. I would love to have a conversation with people who believe fervently that what they are doing is more constructive, energetically, for their lifeline, for the cultivation of social behaviors, whatever it may be. You guys are saying you're fostering good health and well-being. Let's discuss.
Yeah, we have a
And
deep
so
amount of evidence as well in terms of people who have done those systems and have come to our work and been like, oh, this kind of put it all together. And it's cool that it should be ideally a collaborative discussion. We should be kind of like, again, looking for the truth of what's in these people's experiences as well as our own experience. But it's just so readily, as Anthony knows, turns into clashing and much more competitive discussion sooner than later.
We can all
right,
rest.
and I think, you know, for the most part, looking at the backgrounds of both Naudi and Weck, right? Speaking with empathy for both of them. David Weck underwent a tremendous amount of scrutiny and criticism for his invention of the Bosu ball. People bashed, like, the Bosu ball was the fucking scapegoat for everything wrong with functional fitness for a long time. If you're on T Nation, which is like actually how I got into training, it was all like the default joke was the Bosu ball is stupid, stability training is stupid. Look at these weak motherfuckers balancing on a ball and limiting the amount of force output that they can have because they're too focused on balancing. And then Naudi, fuck man, the amount of criticism and scorn and like absolute attack that he had to experience in his own forming of his company. No shit that it's a little ornery when it comes to criticism. He's hypersensitive because he was fucking attacked relentlessly over and over and over and over again. I mean, I kind of follow that whole saga. I'm trying to put together like almost like a mini timeline video about like how much bullshit Naudi has had to deal with in terms of trying to put together a functional fitness company, especially before it was like a little bit more of a mainstream accessible idea. So in terms of the sensitivity aspect, I find it more interesting when newer trainers have huge egos and are really resistant to criticism about their things because they have an unfounded sense of confidence and an utter lack of humility just based on the certainty that they have in their ideas, not necessarily with the years of experience to back it up. And they don't necessarily have a background reason to be so defensive ego-wise. I actually think that a lot of Naudi and Weck's ego sensitivity, I'm not going to say is justified, but is understandable. Like, I would
validated.
What's
You're thinking
that?
about the validation acknowledgement conversation. They weren't validated. They were acknowledged. The value was acknowledged, but no one was like, this is what it's doing for the industry. It was like, yeah, it's something you can use because there was ego on the other. It's all ego. I'm guilty of it just the same. And that's why there was conflict. But that's why I'm suggesting, answer me this one question. Would they not both benefit? And you tell me this truthfully, friend. Would they not both benefit from a good round of butt breathing?
Of course they would.
Okay, so my point being, neither of them butt breathe. Those are fundamental things, a core, a root, little cork to movement, if you will. And I would love to implement that for the both of them because the crazy visual presentation that both of them can get to when you see them get into sympathetics and they start to like, I know what that's like. I mean, I know what it can feel like. I mean, if I lived another 20 years and got to that point, another 15 years and got to that point, I swear to you, I would be a miserable gremlin. So the fact that they're still being positive and whatever, fantastic. But let's just take that root system out of their bum and butt breathe it up. You know, just fix up some of the tap. Make it a little bit easier so they can communicate their feelings verbally. Because that's one thing that I see not happening in either of them. And this is something I'm willing to take responsibility for saying. Neither of them can look with consistency of a view without their eye being either fixated, non-panoramic, to say that it doesn't look like there's color in their cheeks, it doesn't look like they're like non-reactive while they're talking about emotions. So Naudi, for example, is like fully focused, talking about things that are feeling oriented, which is fundamentally kind of a dichotomy. And when Weck does it, it's always to the effect of being upregulated. So his emotions aren't something that he can downregulate, which is to say that his nerves are here. Naudi may be a little more afraid or a little bit less injured. And it's the same issue that I can recognize myself having and still experiencing. That is, doing that to my eyes used to make me have headaches, used to make me light sick, used to make my ears ring. So with respect to staying in that state, you can disregard sensation and pain and live in a state that justifies, I need to stay at this output level just to be able to live. And I know I can help with both of them.
I can't speak for Weck specifically, but knowing Naudi on like a little bit more of a personal level than just watching him do live streams and seeing the content that he posts,
Sure.
I think a lot of the stress that people see in his presentation is contextual to social media for the most part, in terms of his actual expression of personality outside of the context of responding to criticism and causing whatever social media presence that he needs to do to maintain his business. I actually just find him a fairly like chilled out, focused guy.
So I totally believe that, but you're saying contextually, you're seeing that he has an issue with himself. It's not with the environment, because he's having that issue internally. So it's not like a social disability. He's choosing to not confront that, or at the very least, let it be an issue for him.
I don't know if I fully understand the phrasing, but like the perception that I have is that there's an elevated stress response in reactivity to external criticism within the industry, especially as it relates to other industry professionals. And so there's an exaggerated stress response that he handles through publicly addressing it. And that public presentation obviously exhibits signs of physiological stress and psychological stress that that is almost like dissipated through his public expression, if that makes sense. It's almost like a venting, and that's how he dissipates that stress energy.
I'm just saying, from the perspective of someone who's looking at tone, the visual affect of tonal focus has reduced his ability to fascially integrate with the feelings of his face. So whether or not he is cognizant of them and he's very present to them, they're not expressing, which is to say they're not reflexive anymore. So there's a degree or a barrier when he does go into that sympathetic state that is a transition for him. It is not something that he can retain focus and dopamine, which is to say it's no longer a linear or like a recycling behavior of dopamine, effort, and testosterone. There's probably more to do with effort and testosterone. And then when he can orient back into testosterone, that's going to give him a dopamine cycle. Or relative like effort-bearing behavior, if it's something familiar enough, it's going to be something that facilitates, I know how to do this. So he's relying on the proprioceptive action to be able to reinvigorate those things, which is what his system literally is. Functional patterns to rehab your behavior. Mine is to get rid of your tone and patterns. So I'm just saying, like, he may be like one of the smartest people alive. I can see that he's very, very smart. What I'm suggesting is there is certain things that in his facilitation of all the answers, he's ignoring his own issues.
And so I'm going to throw you a bone and just say, like, I don't disagree that both of these men would benefit tremendously from doing the MovMed work and from butt breathing and from like, that is the bone I'm going to throw you in the situation. Cheers. I'm just playing a little bit of devil's advocate, mostly because I think I've become a little disillusioned with when I started the podcast and I started having these cross conversations. Part of me had this grandiose idea of being like, I'm going to be the one who creates cross communication and unifies the field. It's like, it's not going to fucking happen, bro.
No, I don't.
It's not going to fucking happen. Like the idea of I've tried to talk to different systems about other systems ideas without even name dropping the other systems to see if I could bypass the ego effect. And it actually has nothing to do with the fact that there's it's like, it is literally just an outside idea will bounce off other people. We'll bounce off them. No, and so, hey,
no listening behavior. They hear what they want to hear, but they're not listening to what's going on. I would say that be too visually focused. And I know it sounds like I'm saying things that are like irrelevant to things you might think, but if your visual system is your entire vestibular system, you don't hear as well. Take it from someone whose ears rang from childhood. My ears started opening up and I'm like, oh, I can hear. My memory got better. But how are these things? I sleep better now. I smile easy. Oh, these must be biomechanics. Biomechanics, guys. Not something overly complex and neurally integrated, but biomechanics. Fascia.
Which, like, it has its relevancy, but it's chicken or the egg situation, I think, in a lot of cases. And this is, I like, part of me is really curious as to what my experience with MovMed would have been if I hadn't done all the biomech stuff first.
Totally.
You know, like what would it have been if I had jumped straight from CrossFit into just doing MovMed? How would that have informed my results in a different way?
Way worse. Their ability to communicate important topics and their ability to get you educated where you want to be educated is great. But specificity and detailed action is different between MovMed and FP. And that's all I'm saying. Like, you're going to get benefit. I just want to distinguish that no matter, look at how the person behaves and how they speak on their thing. I am very confident in my shit. I can be egotistical in my drive to communicate that. But at the end of the day, I don't want to be telling myself at like bedtime, you're so fucking good. Good job, dude. I want to be like, all right, we can work on these things so we can have relationships, because we're all social creatures at the end of the day, no matter what. Even if we're millionaires, even if we're poorer than shit, we are all solely functional by way of our ability to socialize. And that's what community is. That's what tribe is. And all of us don't focus on the social. They focus on the external. Social is an interaction, a visceral communication of gesticulation, of energy sharing, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, there's a difference between watching like the color in your face enliven as you've talked about things that are passion bearing versus. And when you're talking about these things that are connected, there's a difference. Like you're not gonna be like, oh, I want to hang with that dude. Dude, that guy's probably cool to have a beer with. You know what I mean?
I know what you mean. I 100% know what you mean. So I got one more minute before I got a jet here. What would be the bow on top of this entire conversation? I thoroughly enjoyed this, by the way. This was like one of my favorite conversations I've had recently.
Appreciate you. One request, because there's so much of this story that's being told by way of the MovMed perspective, I would love for you guys to have a podcast just by yourselves. I'm not sure if that's something you guys would do here or with Art of Move or whatever, but FP can be the discussion without me having any, because I'm not FP. I have no idea. I don't know what I'm talking about. So there is fairness in being like, fuck this guy's opinion. So I think it'd be appropriate for you guys to better contextualize what the conversation is, because I've done most of that.
Yeah, sure. I'd be more than happy to do that.
Yeah, and then just talk about how do you get the best out of both. And then like where is there maybe some conflict, or where you need to explore the spectrums of thought amongst the way that you're implementing stuff with your clients or for yourself. But thanks so much for coming on, man. This was a really good conversation. I'm excited for people to hear and react to this. So
likewise. Thank you guys. This was really fun. I can't wait for the next one.
Yes, sir.
Likewise. Thanks.
Take care, guys.